My talk, first I'd like to thank you very much for being here on behalf of Pfizer. As Dave just mentioned, I work for the largest pharmaceutical company in the world. And in fact, sometime this fall, we're going to be even larger as we acquire another large pharmaceutical company. But the topic of my talk today is actually to try to convince you that, well, you know, we're big, but we're not really that big. And we've been bad, perhaps, but we're not really that bad. It's actually not going to be a very difficult argument to make, considering, especially the big argument, considering the way the figures of $1 trillion are thrown around Washington these days. It's not. We're going to be a pretty small part of this. So I've organized the talk in sort of trying to figure out where I should point this. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Okay. So the first fact, so this is going to be a fact-filled 10 minutes, so bear with me. Lots of charts, at least the colors are nice, so hopefully you won't be completely bored. The first thing that I want to mention is that despite probably public perception, only 10 cents out of every healthcare dollar goes to pharmaceuticals. Okay? There are possibly reasons why people perceive that this percentage is much higher, and I'll discuss those in slightly later slides, but do keep this in mind. We're 1 in 10 of the healthcare dollar. And this has a very important mathematical implication. It basically says that whatever you do to the rate of growth of pharmaceutical spending or the level of pharmaceutical spending, you're only going to affect national health spending by a factor of 1/10. So if you cut pharmaceutical spending in half, you're only going to be able to reduce national health spending by 5%. Okay? By the same token, if you double pharmaceutical spending, you're only going to increase national health spending by 10%. And it's important to keep that in mind, that the other 90%, primarily 50 of those 90% are hospitals and physician dollars, are the main driver of health spending in the United States. Okay? Sorry. Technical difficulties. There we go. The second thing I'd like you to know is that most prescriptions that are written in the United States are written for generic medicines. Okay. This setup, as you can see, this chart goes from 1984, which was the year a very important legislation for our industry was passed called Hatch-Waxman, that made it easier and more convenient and more rational for generic companies to enter into the market after our patents and exclusivities are expired. And the generic industry has done very well. They've taken a larger and larger proportion of scripts, and that's the way it ought to be. As an industry, we're perfectly comfortable with a situation where we invest, spend a lot of money, develop new medicines that are hopefully useful, and at some point we lose our exclusivity to those medicines, allow generic companies to enter, bring competition and lower prices. Okay. All right, let's go to the, some of the arguments that have been mentioned about the industry. We're accused, I don't know if it's necessarily an accusation in a capitalist society, but it is an accusation nevertheless that we're very profitable. Please don't let our investor relation folks know that I put this slide up. But unfortunately, as an industry, the only, from an economic point of view, profits play a really important role. They provide the signals for where investment dollars should go. So I'm sure a lot of you are stockholders and bondholders, and you would like to invest in areas that are going to provide a return for your investment. And the most important signal of profitability is what that return is. If you invest $1 today, or in fact in this case, in this particular slide, if you invested $1 10 years ago, how much return did you earn on that dollar, whether it's in capital gains because your shares have become more valuable, or because of dividends that you earn. And what you see is that the pharmaceutical industry over the past decade has actually earned a negative return. Now, there are a lot of factors that have contributed to this, but at least, the silver lining to this cloud is that we should not be accused of being extremely profitable or opportunistic. I mean, we do create a lot of important medicines, and we work very hard to make those medicines accessible to everybody. However, We would like to be more profitable, of course, but make sure that you do know the fact that we are not that profitable. Okay, so what happens then if profitability is increased or decreased even further? Well, one thing that we've discovered is that there's a very tight relationship between profitability and revenues in the industry and employment in the industry. This is an industry that employs excellent people with excellent educational backgrounds. It's a very innovative industry. The average wages in this industry are higher than the national average. And there's a very tight relationship between changes in revenues for the industry and changes in employment in the industry. So always remember that, yes, when we go out there and try to implement health reform, the industry is going to contribute its part towards whatever health reform gets passed. However, we should always be cognizant of the costs that imposing revenue reductions on the industry will mean for jobs, okay? And particularly good jobs. Okay, I want to talk a little bit also about our drug development process. People believe that, you know, we're essentially marketing machines. We sit down, university professors and the National Institutes of Health sit down and develop all the science. They essentially invent most of the medicines, and then we take them, slap a label on them, start marketing them, and charge an exorbitant rate. This is actually a pretty false picture of what happens. The National Institutes of Health and academic scientists play a really important role, but it's typically at the idea generation stage. It's very early on. It's in preclinical work. We, as an industry, spend billions of dollars, to the tune of about $50 billion a year. Billions, by the way, people get confused about millions versus trillions because we've been using these numbers, but billions are pretty large. They have 9 zeros. And we go through this 12 to 15 year process to develop what would be effectively a medicine that's approved by the Food and Drug Administration for consumption by patients. And this process, as you can see, is very long, very involved, very risky. You start with tens of thousands of potential compounds that get narrowed down through discovery and preclinical examination. Then they go through clinical trials, which winnow them down even further. This process, as I said, takes 10 to 12 years, 10 to 12 to 15 years, and costs approximately $1.3 billion per approved drug.